Hi, welcome to the Key Concepts lecture for Philosophy of Psychology, Week 12. And this week we're thinking about free will and responsibility. And this has long been a subject in philosophy where people have talked about the issue of free will and determinism. And that's often in the sense of sort of physical free will, that this idea that whether we're sort of able to make free choices or whether our choices are determined by prior causes. And if they're determined by prior causes, whether we think of those causes as sort of physical or even sort of, brain events, it means that we don't have free will in the metaphysical sense if our events, if everything that we do is caused by prior events. So there's, in philosophy, that's been the kind of debate about free will and free will as opposed to determinism, the idea that everything is caused and everything in the universe is caused by prior things. As we'll see, this debate has been taken up in psychology as well, and the question of whether a number of studies in psychology and neuroscience show that people don't actually make free choices, and that cast doubt on the idea of possessing free will. So we'll start off by looking at some of the concepts and how to understand the idea of free will, and then we'll take a look at some of the psychological studies that have been done that are supposed to or are said to cast doubt on the possibility of humans having free will and acting freely and consciously. Okay, so the free will problem we can put like this. Much of life seems to be outside of our control. Obviously, the past we can't change. Our body is largely outside our control. The makeup of the universe, even when we will die, is probably outside our control. But we do think that we control our present and future actions. Things like where we spend the next few hours, what to eat for dinner, whom to vote for, whether to stay in college after getting an associate's degree. In these cases, we think it is up to us what to do. So where our own actions are concerned, it seems like we're in charge. And insofar as we see how we act as under our control, our lives can be our own achievement or failure. In other words, we think of ourselves as the authors of our own lives if things are in our control. So this problem of whether we control the way we act is what philosophers refer to as the free will problem. Is it something that we freely exercise through making choices that affect the course of our lives, or is much of the course of our lives outside of our control? So we think about free will. We're understanding freedom as the control over how we act, and our will refers to our capacity for decision making. So it's control and that capacity for making decisions that will influence and sort of set the course of our future. So we usually think wants and feelings, for example, lie outside our control. We're not responsible for our feelings as they're not the result of a conscious decision. We don't sort of decide to become angry. We don't decide to become sad. They're things that kind of come over us. Often they're sort of things that we don't control when they appear. So, of course, we can sometimes influence our feelings through action. For example, going for a run might make us hungry or might even make us sort of feel better, feel happier. But when we talk about freedom, we're usually talking about action, right? Rather than sort of feelings or anything else. We're talking about our capacity to act and to make decisions about what to do. So the important thing is that much of our morality and our criminal justice system depends on the idea that people are accountable for how they live and what they do. And accountability goes together with responsibility. So moral responsibility requires that the agent is in control of what he or she does. Because if the agent isn't in control, if you didn't act consciously and under your own control, how can you be morally responsible for the things that you did? So this is why we're not usually considered morally responsible for our feelings and desires. We may feel hostile towards somebody, but treat this as a feeling that, as we say, just came over us, not something we actually endorse. So the link again is with control and action. It's in the case of action that we're supposed to kind of exercise control over who we are and what we do. Okay, so we're going to look at the issue of free will as it's been approached in psychology and neuroscience. And there are two relevant questions here that come up. And the first one is the philosophical question of, are humans free agents? And what does it mean to be a free agent? How do we sort of understand this idea of freedom? And we've been talking about this idea of control over our actions. And the second is, if so, how much freedom do they actually have? So this week we're going to look at several studies in psychology and neuroscience that appear to challenge the ascription of free will to human beings. Now, the authors of the textbook this week, Miyazono and Bortolotti, argue that although there is no conclusive evidence against free will, it does seem from these studies that we're not as free as we might think. So there does seem to be some evidence, but not complete and overwhelming evidence to reject the idea of free will. So let's just define the positions in this debate then. We've got libertarian. Here is the term for people who think free will exists and humans possess it, so they can make free decisions under their own control, that are not manipulated or motivated by things they are unaware of. Determinism, sometimes called hard determinism, says that all actions are caused by prior events and therefore there is no free will. So determinism is obviously in conflict with the libertarian position. They say opposite things. Now there are two positions on how these two positions relate. Incompatibilism takes the view that free will and determinism are incompatible with each other. And it looks to be that way when you look at them. One says free will exists and the other says all actions are caused by prior events, so there must be no free will. But the position of compatibilism says that if we understand them properly, free will and determinism are compatible with each other, that there's no necessary problem of us thinking ourselves free because we don't have the type of control that the free will argument says. So somebody who's a compatibilist might argue that if our choices follow from things we believe we value and things we hold dear and things we care about, and our choices reflect things we care about, then it's not really worth worrying about whether we possess free will in the kind of control sense that we're talking about here. All that matters is that we're able to live according to our values and things that we feel to be important, and we're able to sort of act consistently in a way that furthers those things. So that's the compatibilist position, that there's no necessary contradiction between the two. Okay, so we're going to look at the area that the authors call scientific epiphenomenalism. And we talked about epiphenomenalism before, this idea that consciousness is just a screen, but it doesn't really sort of make any decisions. It's caused by brain events, but doesn't cause any events in the physical world. So scientific epiphenomenalism is using the empirical findings in psychology and neuroscience to show that conscious thoughts and conscious decisions play no role in behavior. And if that's the case, if we're not consciously deciding and consciously sort of making decisions about what to do, then it seems that decisions are being made for other reasons or for reasons that we don't control, and as part of processes that we don't actually control. So let's have a look at some of these studies. All right, so the first are called Libet-style studies after Benjamin Libet, who performed these studies in a number of iterations. And what happens is the participants were asked to perform a sudden flick of the wrist whenever they wanted. Now, they were able to time it uses sort of brain measuring techniques to time the preparatory brain activities, and that's measured by readiness potential onset. In other words, there appears to be brain activity leading up to the wrist flick. Conscious intention was self-reported, and as we see from this chart, readiness potential, so the brain activity is about 550 milliseconds before the act, and it occurs significantly before the awareness of conscious intention, which is closer to 200 milliseconds. So the experiment suggests that conscious intention appears too late to drive action. So this is the kind of epiphenomenalism idea that things are happening under the surface, the sort of brain activity, that's really what's driving the decision to flick the wrist. And we only become conscious of the decision at a later date when the decision has already been made, in other words, by brain activity, not by conscious intention. So the experiment seems to suggest that conscious intention appears too late to drive action. By the time conscious intention appears, the action has already been sort of triggered by brain activity and is sort of on the way to completion. Now, Libet himself suggested that consciousness coming up at this point of awareness slightly before the movement can sort of intervene, can play what we called before the default interventionist. And if it doesn't sort of agree with the sort of pending action, it can sort of rule it out and decide not to do it. Others take the sort of lawyer position here and say that consciousness again is just doing post hoc rationalization rather than actually doing anything significant to drive the action. So that's a significant question here, is if conscious intention is much later than the brain activity that triggers action, what is it doing? Is it just a kind of, as epiphenomenalism says, is it just a surface awareness of a movement that's already been triggered elsewhere? Or is it actually part of the decision-making process? Another question here is how generalizable these studies are. The action, of course, of flicking the wrist is pretty insignificant. And it's not clear that this would be sort of generalizable to other kinds of actions which are not insignificant, which we care about, and which indeed we spend a long time sort of thinking about and making a decision. Second group of studies are situationist studies. And these studies attempt to show that behavior is determined by external situations. So we looked at the Good Samaritan study in the textbook, and participants were seminary students who were asked to give a short sermon. Some of them were told to hurry across campus because they were in the late condition. Others were told to take their time. So 63% of those not in a hurry versus 10% of those in a hurry helped a groaning stranger they passed. So that's the sort of Good Samaritan part of the study. So it seems like the time pressure, which is the sort of situationist element here, the time pressure particularly affected those who believe their research participation was of vital importance. So participants in the low hurry condition are more likely to help. Other factors that were introduced in the study, say thinking about the Good Samaritan parable before sort of being asked to do the study, didn't really make a difference. Didn't make a difference before they did the action. So they show that. So it seems to show that situational factors are influencing behavior here. Those in a not hurry condition were much more likely to help. Although we can't say that situational factors from this example fully determine behavior, although they do seem to have an influence. Also, if we take the question of generalizability again, how generalizable are these findings? Again, people tend to take a long time over decisions they care about. where to buy a house, buying a car, getting married, that sort of thing. Given that's the case, it's not clear that sort of this idea of being in a hurry condition and how it changes our behavior, really tells us a lot about those sort of important long-term decisions. So the third group of studies are these Wegner-style studies, which generate this illusory experience of conscious will. So the participant feels they are consciously choosing and report that they are consciously choosing, but in fact it's an illusory experience. So the participants are primed to stop at a particular object on a screen by hearing word prompts in their headphones. So even when another person was moving the cursor and not them, they believe themselves to be making a conscious decision to stop the cursor. We can see in this diagram what's actually happening is there's a sort of unconscious cause of action, and that sort of leads directly to the action, but there's a kind of apparent causal path that goes from sort of creating the thought in the person's mind by the word prompt to the action itself. And the participant believes that that's the causal path, that hearing the word prompt is what sort of stimulate or what sort of led them to perform the action of stopping the cursor. But here they neglect the actual causal path, which is somebody else sort of manipulating and controlling, and them hearing the key word and thinking it was them that were doing it. So again, we can ask here, is this study generalizable? Right? The action is manipulated here as somebody else is being given a prompt, and it gives this illusory experience of conscious will. But is ordinary daily activity like this? To argue for the causal irrelevance of conscious action, Wegner appeals to other automaticity studies that trace action to non-conscious processes. But then this means that Wegner's studies don't provide independent evidence for this. So overall, it seems these studies show some limits on conscious action, but they don't fully support epiphenomenalism. Right? They don't fully support the idea that we're not sort of making choices in any situations. So the studies are not fully generalizable. They don't allow us to sort of conclude that conscious will is an illusion, although they do give some interesting cases where it seems like we can believe we're acting freely even though our choices are manipulated, or we can think that we're making choices even though we're not. Now, another area where we can look for really thinking about the consequences of this idea of free will and responsibility by looking at the idea of implicit bias. And the textbook gives us this example of Elsa. So as we see, Elsa thinks of herself as an egalitarian person, respects everybody and treats people equally, irrespective of ethnic origin or skin color. It turns out, however, that she has been implicitly biased in a systematic manner. Some of her everyday behaviors are not coherent with her self-image. She tends to ignore her Nigerian secretary, avoid sitting next to Asian passengers on public transport, and so on. Now, these biases, of course, could well be ethically problematic. If Elsa is evaluating CVs and she's judging people based on her sort of reactions to their ethnicity, that's going to be problematic. If she's a police officer judging whether a white person or a black person is holding a gun, again, that's going to be ethically problematic. If she's engaging in these sort of behaviors that are not coherent with her self-image. To say that biases are implicit is to say that people don't have access to them via introspection. In other words, you can't examine your mind and see your bias. You can't sort of look in the mind and see it. It's as though we're not aware of them because they act automatically. Pretty much like the sort of type 1 processes we talked about in dual process theory. They seem to work on a sort of automatic level that evades our conscious thinking. So we don't ordinarily have access to them. And of course, that seems to support an idea that if we don't have access to them, if we're not aware of them, if we're not in control of them, then how can we be responsible for them? Now, the test for implicit bias, the most well-known test is the IAT, the implicit association test. There are many versions of this, but there's one version is what's called a race IAT, which tests for implicit associations around racial identity. So the basic idea is to assign a word to the left if it fits the category good, and to assign the word right if it fits the category bad. And so you do several sort of versions of this. And participants tend to slow down considerably and make mistakes when the task is to assign black faces to the good category and white faces to the bad category. You can see on the right here the sort of percent of web respondents with each score. There's definitely a preference for white faces compared to black faces, and we can see how that preference scales here quite heavily in favor of those preferences for white faces. Now, one thing to say here is that it's not clear how IAT scores correlate with actual behavior. They do seem to show an implicit association of black people with bad things and white people with good things. And they seem to show that people hold these implicit associations, but we don't really know how those associations are sort of associated with behavior, whether they're sort of linked to behavior, whether there are other processes that sort of come into play in social settings. So one sort of, I think, plausible way of reading this is it's simply what we're looking at here are the sort of consequences of living in a racist society, and seeing how that sort of affects people at a kind of implicit, automatic, unconscious level. And the question is whether people are sort of responsible for these implicit biases and whether they can do anything about them. And of course, those questions are very much interlinked. So is Elsa blameworthy and responsible for her implicit biases? So we think firstly that people cannot be responsible for things they are not aware of. And people don't seem to be aware of their biases. So because they're not aware of them, they're not aware of them sort of when they appear, it seems like they can't be responsible for them. And the second thing is that biases appear to work automatically. So people cannot really be responsible for things over which they have no control. So if the process is working automatically, if it's just working by itself and we don't have any control over it, again, it's hard to think how we can be responsible. So these are the argument from awareness and the argument from control. We lack awareness of our biases and we lack control over them. And these two things both seem to argue against responsibility. But we might not want to jump to this conclusion too quickly, because there's also the question of indirect awareness and its relation to responsibility. Of course, Elsa doesn't have direct awareness of her biases. She can't look inside her brain and see them. But she may have indirect awareness and indirect control. And that may make a difference to whether we see her as sort of responsible and able to act on her biases or not. Perhaps she takes an IAT test. Perhaps she hears remarks of her friends and colleagues about her behavior being questionable. If those things happen, then Elsa has an indirect awareness. So this is the response to the argument that Elsa is not responsible for her biases. Perhaps her company has trainings on sort of racial awareness which she doesn't attend. Perhaps she doesn't read circulars and emails about discrimination. So if we feel that Elsa has had ample chance to become aware of her biases through social interaction, but she simply refused to do so, we may well feel she's responsible for them. So the question here becomes whether Elsa ought to be aware of her biases, whether we think that given the social interactions she's had or she might have in the workplace with other people, that she ought to become aware of those biases and be able to act on them, perhaps by changing the media she consumes, by sort of doing sort of meditations or calming herself in some way, but certainly something to sort of address the unconscious bias and sort of kind of cancel out the unconscious bias, perhaps by sort of conscious efforts to identify with people of color or ethnicities that she feels she's been hostile towards. So this is the question of whether she ought to be aware of her bias, and I think the answer here is I think a sort of a mixed one, because because we don't have sort of direct awareness and things. We're not going to say we're completely in control of our biases, but there does seem to be some element of control. It does seem to be that we can become aware of them, and if we can become aware of them, we can act on them in some degree by trying to affect them. Okay, so we've seen psychological and neuroscientific studies about free will this week, and it seems like they support a moderate skepticism about free will. So we can say people are not as free as they might think. And of course, this follows from a lot of things we've talked about this semester: the rationality, the dual process idea that a lot of our sort of thinking is automatic and unconscious. This is not necessarily a shocking conclusion for us, but it definitely supports other things that we've seen about human behavior in the course. And it raises the question of borderline cases like implicit bias, where it is not clear if people are free and responsible. It seems in some ways we can say, yes, they can act on biases and sort of counteract them, but it's not totally clear that they can sort of do that in a sort of fully committed and sort of fully controlling way. So there's some control, but maybe not total control. So it seems like a borderline case where we can't sort of say clearly yes or no either way. Okay, so for this week there's no VoiceThread task and no markup assignment. The big task for this week is paper 2, which is due at the end of the week. Again, I'll have office hours and I'll be on email as usual. If you have any questions, if you want to run something by me this week before you hand in the paper, you can reach out and get in touch. There is a quiz 11, which we're doing this week. It's based on this chapter, Free Will and Responsibility. So read the chapter again, have a go at the quiz, and hopefully you'll be working on the papers. And like I said, reach out if you need anything before the end of the week.